Depression. Well, we're already in the Depression. Also, on a previous show about the Federal Reserve, we also gave you this warning, economic storm warning. This is from the Providence Journal, Providence, Rhode Island, of July 1992. Former banker and financial analyst Michael William Haga, author of the forthcoming book, On the Brink, How to Survive the Coming Great Depression, 1993 to the year 2000, says, quote, "Within the next 12 months, the international banking system will collapse. The world's stock exchanges will crash to pre-World War II levels. Real estate values will plunge 85% or more, and countless numbers of ordinary people worldwide will be left holding the bag." This is just a confirmation of what I had predicted years before. You only hear these things on the hour of the time and nowhere else. What you're hearing tonight, folks, and what you've already heard already, is astounding information that you will not hear on the 6 o'clock news, on any channel, or on any other radio station. You heard it here on the hour of the time first. And remember this. So far, I've only been wrong once. In all of the many predictions that I've ever made, I've been wrong exactly one time. When I said that Manuel Noriega would not be found guilty in an American court of law and would not serve any time in jail, I was wrong. But that's the only time that I've been wrong. Now I'm going to read you an article from the New Federalist. Deficit figure was pre-election fiction. Listen closely to this, folks, by Chris White of the EIR News Service. The federal government's deficit for the fiscal year ending September 30th was $290 billion. The figures were announced at the end of last week by the Treasury Department. Like the GDP numbers up 2.7% and the weekly unemployment claims down, the report was evidently someone's idea of good news to be made available to the public in the last days before the election. The $290 billion final figure is significantly lower than the nearly $400 billion projected by the Office of Management and Budget earlier in the year. Unlike the GDP report, it will probably not be revised in the weeks following the election, but that doesn't make the report any more real than the GDP figures were. Since the size of the deficit is now about the same magnitude as the interest payments on the entirety of the federal government's debt, and those interest payments happen to be the biggest line item in the federal budget, excluding entitlement programs. You hear people saying, quote, "Well, why don't we just cut out the interest payments and everything will balance," unquote. Sounds like common sense, but is it reality? It's a fiction, folks. First of all, the amount reported as the federal deficit is a fiction. Fiction. It's graphic enough that it could even be the subject for Madonna's next book. It doesn't include the $60 billion, that's billion with a B, folks, that administration and Congress alike agreed was necessary to continue to resolve bankrupt S&Ls, and doesn't count what's already been paid, and doesn't even make allowance for the fact that that $60 billion is way too low. It doesn't include the $80 or so billion that was looted out of the Social Security Trust Fund again this year to help reduce the apparent size of the deficit. And it doesn't include the more than $70 billion that has already been incurred by the taxpayer in not shutting down the 10 or so largest bankrupt banks. And that's coming. Let me read you that last one again. And it doesn't include the more than $70 billion that has already been incurred by the taxpayer in not shutting down the 10 or so largest bankrupt banks. Those bills are all coming due. So why not put them where they belong and say that the deficit is already about $500 billion this year? Cut out the interest payment and you still have a $200 billion plus deficit. Since 3/4 of the $4 trillion federal debt matures over the next 5 years, there is another $600 billion to be financed or refinanced each year on top of the current shortfall. Folks, that leaves $800 billion after the interest payments are stopped, if you could even do that. We are now at the point where the financing of the deficit and the amortization and rollover of federal debt is more each year than the revenues received by the Treasury from taxes collected from individuals. This is rather more than $600 billion. Revenues collected or received by the Treasury from taxes will also decrease in the coming years as more and more people find out that it's the biggest scam that's ever been conducted in this country, and that they don't really even have to pay those taxes. It's voluntary, you see, and they have been defrauded into thinking that they are taxpayers when the law clearly says that most of them are not. Eliminating the interest payments won't do much about anything either. You see, it isn't a question of what the federal government spends its money on. It's the way we insist on doing things that is the problem. In the Constitution, folks, Article 1, Section 8, the Founding Fathers laid out how the government should manage its finances and economic policy. In their view, the government, specifically Congress, is empowered to create money and protect its value. Financing the operations of federal government by selling debt through the Federal Reserve is not mentioned, nor would it be. The Revolution was fought to defeat exactly those kinds of practices, as the Declaration of Independence, for those of you who have ever read it, makes perfectly clear. The practice happens to be illegal, made worse because the Federal Reserve, after all, is merely a private institution, and it has been illegal ever since the Federal Reserve was created. To insist it was created by act of Congress doesn't change anything. Congress does not have the power to hand away its own powers or to change the Constitution in any other way than that outlined within the Constitution, allowing for its change. The interest on the debt is not the problem. Using the power of government to create debt to line the pockets of private interest and then farm out the tax revenues to service the debt you seriously created is the problem. It is supposed to be very different. Government is supposed to issue credit. The credit is not secured against the tax revenues, but against the wealth generated through the extension of credit in the form of productivity increases in the economy. In United States history, this has been done through financing of infrastructure projects, toll road, canal, and railway construction in the 19th century, down to NASA more recently. NASA's budget line functions as credit for suppliers and subcontractors with relevant multiplier effects in the economy as a whole. That's how it works. Jobs are created through such means. The tax revenues are increased not by raising tax rates, but by increasing the number of taxpayers through putting people back to work building things that we need. Until that is done, the out-of-control deficit will balloon. You want to cut the deficit? What exactly do you want to cut? Your grandmother's medical payments? Your aunt's retirement funds? Cuts, folks, will translate into deaths, into job losses, into new claims for unemployment benefits, and soon enough they will translate into ever bigger deficits. We've been through it before over the last 12 years. Each time the deficit doubles. This time it is different. Now America's largest corporations, starting with General Motors and IBM, are charging off their losses. That means that jobs go, health plans go, retirement plans go, all to satisfy the claims of their creditors, the so-called outside directors in the case of General Motors. That's the Depression. When the government goes down that path and the corporations go down that path, then it's only a matter of time before the spiral thus created runs out of control. That is what we have been warning you about. And that is the end of the article. An article, by the way, that is right on the money, folks. Now, back to this other stuff. The number of fraudulent banks in the USA that will be published in the upcoming issue of the CAGI newsletter is 26. Fraudulent Canadian banks are 90 that we've been able to identify, and there are 50 fraudulent Caribbean banks, many of them operating inside this country. Have you got your money in one of those banks? And how are you going to survive what's coming on December the 19th? Now, don't go off half-cocked, folks. None of the banks are going to close their doors on December the 19th, as you've been told by all these fanatical, I don't know what you call them, rumor mongers. It's not going to happen. On December the 19th is when the law takes effect. That's when banks will receive their rating. That's when they will be categorized under one of the 5 categories and one of the 3 supervisory subgroups. You should go to your bank after December the 19th and ask them which category they fall into under the new F.D.I.C. rating law and which supervisory subcategory they fall into. If they fall into the lower categories, they will be required to submit a plan, and restrictions will be put upon that bank. Within a certain period of time, if they have not recovered, or if they have not made significant progress toward an eventual recovery, then the bank will be placed into receivership. So understand that on December the 19th, the banks are not going to close their doors. That's when the law goes into effect. They will begin receiving their ratings. They will have to submit a plan for recovery. And then depending upon how well they do or how well they don't do, or whether they just stay the same, that will decide which banks actually close their doors, go into receivership, declare bankruptcy, or become absorbed by some larger major bank. So understand that, folks. Understand it. Don't go off half-cocked. But you need to know what your bank rating is. You should go down and ask them. Now, for the ratings, those ratings, let me see here. Here we go. For those ratings which include the supervisory subgroups, there are 3 categories: well-capitalized, adequately capitalized, and undercapitalized. The banks that fall in the undercapitalized subgroup category and in the B or C supervisory subgroup are in big trouble. In fact, undercapitalized banks are in trouble anyway. And you should know which banks those are. Whatever bank you have your money in, go in and ask them what is their rating under the new F.D.I.C. law, including the supervisory subgroup rating of A, B, or C. This determines what insurance premium they're going to pay for the federal deposit insurance coverage on the accounts. Also, which accounts are covered and which are not have also been changed. So if you have certain types of accounts which you think are covered by the F.D.I.C., they may no longer be covered, and you should make sure that you know which accounts those are, folks. Make sure you know which accounts those are. Now, it doesn't matter what you do with your money or where you put it. It's in danger in this time. But these are the country's top 10 blue ribbon banks. Top 10 blue ribbon banks. These banks right now are not in any danger of folding. So, if you want to take advantage of this knowledge, that's up to you. But here are the banks. Citizens Commercial and Savings Bank, 1 Citizens Banking Center, Flint, Michigan, 48502. Their phone number is 313-766-7500. The Dauphin Deposit Bank and Trust Company, 213 Market Street, Post Office Box 2961, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 17105, and their number is 717-255-2121. The Davenport Bank and Trust Company, 203 West 3rd Street, Davenport, Iowa, 52801, and their number is 319-383-3211. The Farmers and Merchants Bank of Long Beach. This is the bank my grandmother had her account in for just about her whole life. Farmers and Merchants Bank of Long Beach, 302 Pine Avenue, Box 1370, Long Beach, California, 90802. And that number is 213-437-0011. The First National Bank of Anchorage, 646 West 4th Avenue, Box 100720, Anchorage, Alaska, 99510. And their phone number is 907-276-6300.